Hello everyone! I finally managed to test Intel's new integrated R graphics in the new Meteor-Lake H series in a proper way. But this time I used the slightly slower Intel Core Ultra 5 125H inside this Acer Swift GO 14, which constantly pulled over 30 watt and provided mostly pretty okay gaming results compared to the old Intel Iris Xe graphics, while some games have been a bit problematic.
Is Hubwood.
By the way, the Core Ultra 5 is the new naming for what Intel used to call i5 for the last 15 years. They just changed that. Now, the iGPU in this chip only has 112 of the maximum of 128 EUs and 7 instead of 8 Xe cores. I'll provide the full spec of the laptop in the description, and I also might make a short review about it in the future. By the way, all of today's tested games have been benchmarked while the laptop was plugged in and using the Swift GO's performance mode and the newest available Intel drivers as of early January 2024. Feel free to use the timeline or the description to look out for specific games. And like always, I was using an external capture card to prevent any performance loss due to capturing. But now, since you obviously clicked on that thumbnail to see how well this new CPU inside of this pretty compact laptop can game, let's start with the benchmarks.
For Apex Legends, I was told by you guys to always use low settings, as that's how most committed players would play it. And these settings at 1080p resulted in an average of 64 FPS and a 1% low of 33 FPS, while it seemed to be mostly stable and okay in my opinion. Sure, it's not amazing, and using 900 or 720p could actually make sense, as this laptop does actually have a seldom 90Hz refresh rate monitor, so 90 FPS would be a good target as well. But overall, it was playable okay, I guess. At 1080p and low settings, the new Arc chip in this Meteor-Lake CPU managed to achieve around 34 FPS on average and a 1% low of 24 for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Not amazing, but doable for most people that consider playing on such a laptop, I guess. Now, I was trying to test all games at 1080p, but keep in mind that 900p or 720p would grant more FPS. And especially on this laptop with its 2880 by 1800 pixel screen, 900p would make quite some sense, as it's exactly half the pixel dimension, which results in a quite sharp pixel output. I still decided to go for 1080p as a standard for better comparability though. EA decided to stop the Riva Tuner / MSI Afterburner OSD to be compatible with Battlefield 2042, so I was not able to use my usual metrics and can only guess the average and 1% lows FPS in this case. And in this game I actually had to use 720p and low settings to get somewhat playable results, while I still wouldn't really bother playing it that way, as it didn't feel very smooth with its 30 to 50 FPS and a not very fluid feel to it. Might be optimized with further driver updates, but I would not bet on it. And note to myself, I should look out for alternatives to RTSS and MSI Afterburner. City Skylines still seems to be an absolute joke considering performance. Might also be the driver though. At 1080p and low settings, I was not getting anywhere near 30 FPS, basically unplayable and pretty ugly as well. Anno 1800 provides a much better experience while also looking a lot better in my subjective opinion, while of course being a slightly different type of game, I know that. However, let's just jump to the next game. Oh look, it's Anno 1800 and it ran a lot better with around 41 FPS on average using 1080p and low settings without any FSR. And even on this bigger save game with a population of almost 1 million, which can really bring a fast desktop PC to its knees on higher settings. So with confidence I can say it is perfectly playable, and I would surely play it like that myself. But make sure to cancel a lot of appointments when you decide to do so. Playing Cyberpunk 2077 on this iGPU might not be the best idea, since even at 1080p with low settings and Intel's XESS on performance, some heavy stuttering occurred. On some occasions the FPS even fell to the low 20s, while my tested average was around 33 FPS with a 1% low of, well, 10 FPS. Interestingly, for some reason, the CPU package managed to pull a lot more wattage than in any other game, and I don't know why that was. If you have any idea, let me know in the comments. Fallout 4 seemed to work alright despite the weird looking frame time graph. At 1080p and medium settings, I saw an average of 57 FPS with 1% lows at around 43 FPS. Considering the game is 8 years old though, we should expect it to run fine even on integrated graphics. Should this be running faster? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Counter-Strike 2 was playable with around 69 FPS on average at 1080p with low settings and activated FSR on balanced at a deathmatch on Dust 2. The 1% lows were around 39 FPS with only seldom micro-stuttering. To be honest, I think I've expected more because I didn't expect the CPU with its very fast single-core performance to be a bottleneck, because it seemed as if the GPU wasn't fully utilized in this title, but again, always keep in mind it might be the drivers. For Elden Ring, I was choosing 1080p and the low preset, which resulted in around 38 FPS on average with 1% lows at around 21, caused by some stuttering here and there. Capping the FPS at 30 could help in this case, I guess. While more FPS with a lower resolution would probably be a good idea as well. But I just don't really like how Elden Ring looks that way with its mostly blurry edges in such configurations. I also tried to benchmark Call of Duty Warzone, but failed to do so because the game was constantly crashing, often even before I was able to enter a match, no matter if I used the Steam version or the Battle.net version, so sorry. EA Sports FC 24 does not allow the RTSS OSD overlay as well, but I still tried a match at 1080p with medium settings, which seemed to work perfectly fine. And if I had to guess, I would say it was at least 40 FPS or more for the gameplay scenes, while some of the replays seemed to be rendered with less frames per second. But overall, it is perfectly playable on the Ultra Core 5 125H, I guess. And this surely is the kind of game that a lot of people with such laptops would consider playing, so go for it. For Fortnite, I tested both the Battle Royale and the free-to-play LEGO Fortnite survival game. So first up, in LEGO Fortnite, I was using a mix of medium, low and high settings for better graphics, while still maintaining more than 30 FPS on average, which is absolutely enough for my taste in a game like that, considering the hardware we are using. A general apology to all of you. Please excuse me often using German OSD settings. I often forget to change that or just don't have the time to do this for each game when testing such a vast variety of titles. I hope you can ignore that for the most part. Now for Fortnite Battle Royale, I was first testing the game using DirectX 12 with low settings but high view distance with TSR on performance at 1080p and saw an average of around 71 FPS and 1% lows of around 43. Not perfect, but surely doable. Though, take a look at the system's total RAM usage over there. I'm pretty sure that 32GB instead of 16GB of system RAM could actually help in this case. Using the game's low detailed performance mode actually seems to use 1GB less of system RAM, but it also causes the GPU to not be fully utilized. And at 1080p and the lowest settings, the game doesn't run that much better, with an average of 84 FPS and 1% lows of 39 FPS, which was actually a bit less. By the way, no matter for how long I've played it, there still occurred some micro stuttering, as you can see in the frame time graph over here, which is really annoying if you're in the middle of shooting at someone. Probably a memory bus / bandwidth issue or driver related. However, it worked well enough for me to actually get the epic win, though keep in mind that I probably played against a lot of bots. Because I'm so bad they won't let me play against real people, I guess. I actually didn't expect Valorant to work that good, as this game often surprised me with bad performance in the past on several laptops, even with dedicated GPUs, but at 1080p and low settings I saw a super high average FPS of 199 and 1% lows of 93 FPS in a random deathmatch, which is perfectly playable even for more sophisticated gamers, I guess. So if Valorant is your kind of game, you're perfectly fine with the new Intel Core Ultra 5 125H. For No Man's Sky, I was testing 1080p at low settings with FSR enabled in the performance mode, which turned out to be very playable even on planets with a lot of plants and grass and such. The game is hard to benchmark since planets are so different and there are some longer stutters getting in and out of the plane or in and out of the atmosphere, but I was getting around 75 to 85 FPS on average on the planets and even more in space. The frame time graph was looking kind of weird, as if it was constantly stuttering, which I didn't notice when recording the benchmark, so in my opinion, the game seems to be playable really well. For Baldurs Gate 3, I was using the DirectX 11 version, and at 1080p, low settings with FSR and performance, the game looks quite blurry to be honest. And I think something was a bit wrong with the way my main character was displayed. However, I saw an average of around 30 FPS walking around in Act 3 with pretty bad 1% lows of around 9 FPS. That's not a killer in this case, but you'll have to be quite forgiving to enjoy the game that way, I guess. Disabling FSR reduced the FPS to around 25 by the way, while it looks a lot sharper. I also tested another save game in a smaller environment, and the FPS went up by a bit, especially in the cutscenes and dialogues, as you can see here. And I have to point out that loading save games took like forever. And keep in mind that for this game, RAM size is crucial. I'm sure it would run a lot better with 32GB, and make sure that you won't use more than the RAM you have available because it would crash otherwise. I really hate that Forza Horizon 5 ever so often decides to show the night cycle when I want to bench it well. At 1080p and low settings, not the very low settings, keep that in mind, I was able to get a perfectly playable 60 FPS on average with a 1% low of 45 FPS. The experience was very smooth and the game is still looking okay. If you're fine with less than 60 FPS, the medium preset would be an option as well, which you could of course also combine with 900p, especially on a 1800p display. Since the actually hilarious Guardians of the Galaxy was available for free on the Epic launcher the other week, I also added it in my tests. Great game really. I actually used it to play through a whole level I hadn't yet played before. At 1080p and medium settings, I did get around 47 FPS and 1% lows of only 20, but beside the unstable looking frametime graph, it was actually doable. If you prefer, you could of course use low settings or lower the resolutions and get more FPS. But it's working fine. God of War ran with 35 FPS on average and 1% lows of 23 FPS at 1080p plus FSR performance. It's playable and still looking okay. Capping the FPS at 30 could be an option once more. 60 FPS is always desirable, I know that, though 30 FPS is considered to be somewhat playable by most people. So next. For GTA 5 I was using 1080p with normal settings, aka low settings, but combined that with high textures. I then saw an average of 75 FPS with 1% lows of 48 FPS, so it's perfectly playable and probably leaving a bit of headroom to improve some of the graphic settings while still getting 60 FPS on average. I didn't get like any noticeable stuttering and the game felt really fluid like all the time. I also quickly fired up Portal 2 at 1080p and maximum settings, resulting in perfectly fine 116 FPS on average and high 1% lows of 85 FPS. So most all the classics should really be doable just fine on such a modern iGPU, even if it's played on an i5-like CPU. I was also testing the famous roguelike Hades at 1080p, which was perfectly able to fully utilize the 90 MHz of this laptop's screen by getting 90 FPS on average and a high 1% low of around 80 FPS, which was mostly caused by some stuttering when starting conversations and such. So lighter games like this would and should be perfectly playable if the Intel drivers play along, that is, which is not always guaranteed. I was curious about how stuttery Hogwarts Legacy would be. I saw an average of 42 FPS on low settings with FSR performance at 1080p with pretty low 1% lows of around 16 FPS, which is not surprising since this game really isn't running well on weaker systems, but I would say it works. The game tends to stutter a lot if you enter a new area, but usually manages to calm down a bit after a while of playing. It was at least much better than on the Core Ultra 7 MSI 13-inch laptop I've tested the other week, which was heavily power limited. The Intel integrated ARC graphics in this Core Ultra 5 125H actually aced League of Legends at 1080p and maximum settings with an average of around 182 FPS and a 1% low of 129 FPS. So you could even play that one at this laptop's native resolution and still get more than 90 FPS to fully utilize the laptop's 90Hz display. As at 1080p, it doesn't even fully utilize the iGPU, as you can see in the OSD. Microsoft Flight Simulator is kinda playable at 1080p and medium settings with a resolution scaling of 70%. You could of course also choose low settings, but the game really starts to look bad that way in my opinion. And actually 25 FPS and more are kinda enough for this game in most scenarios, as it's a rather slow-paced title, though once again the 16GB of total system RAM could be an issue here. And there have been some noticeable stutters through my benchmark session for sure. But well, at least it didn't crash. Shit. Overwatch 2 was working alright with an average of 85 FPS at 1080p in low settings. The 1% lows have been acceptable with around 55 FPS. So I was almost able to fully utilize the 90Hz display in that case. It should really be enough for some casual after-work fun if you're not too eager about playing the game in a professional way. I was also quickly testing the demo of Ubisoft's new Prince of Persia side-scroller, which surely is a graphically very light jump-and-run game that ran perfectly fine with an average of 60 FPS at the highest possible settings, using the 1080p resolution with high 1% lows of 50 FPS. I'm pretty sure it would also be playable at the display's native resolution, but it is a very undemanding game hardware-wise, while it actually seems to be fun nevertheless. PUBG is already 6 years old and has been optimized a lot since its release in 2017. So at 1080p and very low settings, I was getting a playable average of 63 FPS with 1% lows of around 35 FPS. It's not looking perfect or playable perfect, but it's doable and much more than what a lot of people actually play the game with on older laptops with weaker iGPUs. For Red Dead Redemption 2, I was using low settings with high textures and FSR on balanced mode, which actually does look okay as long as you're moving, because once you stand still, FSR causes the edges to get like super blurry and completely changing the appearance of the game. I had that issue in the past, but as it is working better than not using FSR at all, I would probably go for settings like that. It's just weird that there hasn't been a fix around that. Oh, and as you have already seen for yourself, the average FPS was okay, with 42 FPS, and the 1% lows have been around 31 FPS, which indicates that it was running pretty stable overall. Rocket League was working perfectly fine at 1080p with low settings and FXAA enabled, resulting in an average of 116 FPS with a pretty low 1% low FPS due to the weird frame time graph you can see over here. But I didn't feel any of this and the game just worked perfectly fine for me nonetheless. Probably even good enough for some more sophisticated players. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I was using the integrated benchmark to compare the results with what Jared's Tech achieved on a Ultra-Core 7 laptop. So while using DirectX 12 and high settings, the Ultra-Core 5 125H was achieving an average of 34 FPS, while Jared's Tech was achieving 40 FPS on his Ultra-Core 7 155H and 37 FPS on the AMD RX 780M, which you can also find in handhelds like the ROG Ally or the Lenovo Legion Go. So overall, the results probably have been as expected, I guess. And The Last of Us Part 1, well, it crashed. I couldn't even get into the game's menu no matter what. So I was not able to test this title either, unfortunately. So next game and final sprint. Starfield did not crash, but it was unplayable FPS-wise, and as you can see, there has been some severe graphic problems going on rendering the game with heavy artifacts while testing it at 720p and FSR and low settings. But I really think this could be fixed with future driver updates. I also tried to start Rainbow Six Siege, which also sadly crashed every time I was doing so. Which is a shame, since this surely is a game a lot of people would have liked to see to perform. Well, but maybe this will be fixed in the future as well. And last but not least, I was testing The Witcher 3, but this time I was using the old DirectX 11 version, which is still available and just performs a lot better even without FSR or XESS. So at 1080p and all medium settings, I was getting around 38 FPS on average and 1% lows of 22, which were mostly caused by some specific stutters in some areas, but overall it is pretty playable. In fact, my first playthrough of this game on my old GTX 760 desktop PC back in 2015 performed almost identical, and I was surely able to enjoy it back then.
And that was the last game for today. I know that there are dozens of games I could have tested as well, and I would love to do that. It just takes a lot of time, which I not always have, and I'm sorry if I wasn't able to include your favorites. But be aware that especially lighter esport games, classics, and probably every game from 2018 and earlier will run either okay with at least 30 FPS or even perfectly fine. And as you have seen, even some recent AAA titles are somewhat playable on this CPU. Overall, the performance was pretty much as expected for the most part from what I've heard, with the occasional issues that are most likely caused by early Intel drivers for this new ARC integrated chip. Let's hope that Intel will improve on that issue in the near future, since it's always good to have a healthy competition even in the iGPU/APU segment. And that is all for today. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing for more laptop reviews and gaming benchmarks, and don't forget to like the video as well. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the very end of this video. See you next time, bye bye and tschüss.